Hello, everybody. This is Carlos, and this is the podcast We Make the Pod by Talking. Today, we're going to be talking about Native education on Native reservations, and here we have a guest who is an educator who has experience in teaching on reservations. And besides that, we also have Daniel again. So if you guys can please introduce yourselves very briefly.
I'm Aries. I defer to you, sir.
Cool. Hi. I'm Aries Camel. I'm also UCC alumni, along with Carlos and I believe Daniel as well. I was part of the Native Americans and Hawaiians at UC San Diego. After I graduated, I was a math teacher on the Rosebud Reservation in 2012. And after 4 years, I became the assistant principal of the same high school on the Rosebud Reservation. And then after that year, I became the full principal of the high school on the reservation. I was the principal during the situation involving the Dakota Access Pipeline, during the situation in South Dakota, North Dakota. And during that time, I also taught AP Calculus, while also fighting the pipeline and being a principal. And currently I have some of my students here at Stanford from South Dakota who are finishing undergrad.
Very cool. I am Daniel Yu. I actually did not go to school with Takashi and with Carlos. I met Takashi in grad school at UCLA. We were both in education and have kept in touch over the years. Started teaching in Los Angeles and have moved since to Oakland. I'm now going to be teaching government econ at a high school, Oakland International High School. It's a exclusively newcomer population, and I'm in education. I think I've been in for about 15 years now, and that's my story, briefly.
Cool. And then I'm a PhD candidate, not quite an educator, but I do have some education experience at the college level. So we're going to start. The first question I have for you, Aries, is actually a question you sort of already answered a bit, but basically I was going to ask you a bit more about your background. Maybe you can go into a little bit more detail. You mentioned how you have a student that you're in contact with at Stanford, and so but I don't think you mentioned where you're based at the moment. So maybe go back in reverse and give us the whole story from your experience with Teach for America to your current mentoring responsibilities.
Yeah, sure. So after undergrad, I joined Teach for America. I joined in 2012 as a high school mathematics teacher. And from there, I was placed in South Dakota. And I've never been to South Dakota, never experienced life in Dakotas, but I had a lot of, friends who were from there. And the moment I arrived, I fell in love. Fell in love with the community, fell in love with the work, fell in love with education, and really gained a lot of knowledge around Native education, Indigenous rights, also how to really teach math for the Indigenous students. The Indigenous pedagogy is a completely different field of knowledge that I didn't really understand or fully comprehended, but going into master's level work, I actually learned there's actually Native studies dedicated to teaching Native students. And so I was really fortunate enough to be in the position that I was. So during my time there, I taught remedial math classes to AP Calculus to high school students on the reservation while living there. During the middle of that time, in 2016, I applied to become the assistant principal, and I was surprised that I got the position, maybe because I was very young. I was in my early 20s. I truly believed in the work that I was doing, and so did my community, and so I was able to be part of a change in trying to promote more students into higher education. And so unfortunately during that time too, we also were facing the situation with DAPL, I could send an article that I'm a part of where I'm featured in like Business Insider, because like being like an educational leader in a small community, like you're basically like the face of a lot, especially when your community is about like 500 people. Like being an educator leader, like rural education, like means like you're the face and the voice. And so I spoke very openly about how like the damage that the oil pipeline bursting is a death sentence for us in the Dakotas. And I was able to work with like Dave Archambault, the father of the Cheyenne River. I mean, that's what they were, the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, and a lot of other tribal leaders in like really fighting against this. And at the same time, I was also like coming back and like fulfilling my admin duties and like also helping our math teacher teach calculus because she never taught math before. And so like I got them to do like a project on optimization and like figuring out like the rate of viscosity of like oil going through a pipeline and how it would burst, which actually won them like in a math scholarship award. And yeah, in that same year, one of my students I mentored for 4 years at that point, because I started in 2012, applied and got into Stanford. And so in the subsequent year, one of my mentees got into Stanford as well. I currently moved back to California. My immediate family is here in the Bay Area. And so I'm currently a dean of instruction and culture at one of the schools here in the Bay Area.
Cool. So as a follow-up question to that, what can you tell us a bit about your experience? Well, you were mentioning a little bit about the distinctiveness of education in a rural setting. Can you speak more a little bit about how you would characterize the distinctiveness of teaching in rural settings versus in urban settings, and also specifically in like reservations? And even, I mean, you can even use the specific example of Rosebud, right? Because you were on the Rosebud Reservation.
Right. So yeah, that's in Teach for America. Like I was promoted in this fellowship called the Rural Leadership Fellowship, and essentially, like what I discovered is like you can get your master's in urban education. Like there are fields of study on like urban education and urban like settings, especially around like our brown and black students, primarily Latino and black students. There isn't a lot being offered on like working with Native students and Native communities, especially in rural communities. The needs are a lot different than in urban settings. The opportunities are vastly different. There aren't a lot of social programs that are available in rural settings such as Rosebud. Internships are non-existent. There's actually a food scarcity. We're actually called food deserts, where there's more places, there are more churches than there are to buy bread in Rosebud. There's also like health. Health is a massive issue. There's IHS, which is the American Health Services, which is like a single hospital available for tribal members, but it's vastly not run properly and like also like understaffed. And so there's a lot of like environmental health and like opportunity gaps like present in like a rural setting, especially on the reservation. Sorry, I wasn't sure if I answered your question.
No, that definitely answered. Oh, go ahead, Daniel.
Oh, I was just gonna say you're on mute for a second.
Yeah. Oh.
I was wondering if I could follow up there. So for me personally, I've also been teaching in, but I've been teaching in settings where it's predominantly black, brown, but also some yellow mixed in there, but high poverty. I'm curious to know what specifically, I guess, in terms of the purpose of the institution of education is different in Native communities, rural Native communities, versus sort of an urban poor community, and if you have any knowledge on the distinction between the two.
I could speak like living on Rosebud. Like I guess an example I could give is that like for the closest Walmart or closest like convenience store is 2 hours away.
2 hours.
Yeah. So especially in the winters, like roads are like we would be blizzard in. It would take a very long time for us to receive any service for the roads to be plowed. Especially since we live in Rosebud, which are in other reservations, which are government sanctioned and like federally contracted, these roads aren't the most well kept either. Unlike in the city, which is like municipal, and the local government really takes care of, like, we are federally mandated areas. And so like roads aren't really kept up, infrastructures aren't really there. Businesses aren't on the reservation either. There are jurisdictions that prevent businesses from opening on the reservation. And so there's very little to no opportunity. A lot of, like, once again, like I say, like food subs, like there's a food desert. And like the example, like convenience stores being 2 hours away, like Walmart and other grocery stores. There are a lot of folks who live on commodities, which are commodity foods just like bread, cheese, peanut butter, oil. And that adds to like the obesity problem that happens, a lot of health issues that happen on the reservation. Additionally, like the hospitals that are poorly run at government sanction, like there aren't enough people, and there are also people who generally like don't provide the adequate service for healthcare. In addition, like these are these are some of the problems, but there's a lot of strength in there too, a lot of resiliency. The tribe really works hard in like making sure culture is at the forefront of education, really combating a lot of these issues. So there's a mix. It's unique. Whereas like living in an urban setting, like what I realized in the Bay Area in general, I see like the Bay Area is more as like a tale of two cities. There's like the hyper rich. There's also like those who are not. And it's different on Rosebud because there are no opportunities for there to be hyper rich. It's just one would call it third world living conditions.
So then, within that context, how do the youth think of what the purpose of their education is? Let's say, you were in high school? Were you teaching high school on the res?
Yeah.
How do they conceive of their education and its like purpose, what they do in the classroom versus what it is they live a part of in the society? Like, are they thinking about tests? Are they thinking about grades? You're saying culture's at the forefront. I'm very curious about that.
Yeah. So it's just like any other high school, from what I could tell you. And students, like, I think like whenever I hear the term like first world problems, people like the argument against that is like, oh, people in third world don't have these problems in reality. Like students on the reservations like are also dealing with like high school crushes, are also dealing with like drama, are also dealing like all of these other things, like in addition to all these other systematic things that are happening on the reservation. And so like students on the reservation, like students are also studying for the ACT while also like dealing with the fact that they have these other issues that they're balancing around their life. And it's not to say that like they're not dealing with what you would experience, but it's in addition to everything else. And like I said, like culture's in the forefront. Like students partake in a lot of like ceremonies. Students are doing sweat, which is also kind of neepy out there. Students are doing powwows. Students are doing a lot to really make sure their culture like continues. One important thing is that like Lakota language is like a course that's offered as a foreign language requirement. And so students are retaining and learning the language at school.
So you mentioned that the reservation's very interested in putting culture at the forefront when it comes to education, but it seems that they bring in a lot of the educators that they actually bring onto these schools are people from other parts of the country, not necessarily from the reservation itself. For example, yourself, right? You were from California, and your tribe is actually technically like a non-Lakota educator in this Lakota setting, providing an education that's that's intended to include Lakota cultural elements. So what are that makes me wonder what kinds of educators are welcomed into the high school? Like, what are the teachers like generally? Are there actually local educators, like people who are actually from the community? What's the proportion of local educators versus people who sort of moved in?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Actually, had a lot of conversations about this. At my school in particular, I would say like half were like local. The local tribal college is there, which provides bachelor's in education and a master's in education. So there is a pathway for folks within the community to come back and stay and be in education. I remember when I was initially hired, the principal who hired me talked about, like, we had a staff meeting and someone said, like, we really want to like make sure our students like come back and like become teachers and like, replace us. And the principal at the time was like, yes, we do want that, but we also want the best. We want like the right people in the right roles. And so when I first started, like coming from UC San Diego, like we came from very like activist background. Like we did a lot. And so when I got there, like I was like, it is very radical, like, hey, let's talk about decolonization. And like I was talking, and then, like these parents were like, okay, cool, but can you teach my kid to add? Can you teach my kid how to like what's a derivative? And so like I've come to realize like there's folks want the best people in their schools. And ideally like the best people are coming from within the walls and being grown and coming back. But in the bottom line is like we want the best folks. And like I could say like the best local like language teachers are from the community. Like the best English teacher I met in my life is from there. One of the best science teachers I met was from there. And like I'm grateful and honored enough like that they valued my work as a math teacher to like say I was one of the ones that they wanted me like on their team. And so like that's how they were operating.
Are there any like white American educators at that school?
Yeah, there were a lot. There was a few who'd come in with a kind of savior complex, and had this like idea of like, oh, I'm gonna like teach Native children. I'm gonna like do some like romanticized, like westernized version of like what it means to go on a reservation. And
Well, what did you call it? What's the name?
Like white savior.
White savior. Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was a very odd, especially within Teach for America, it was a very odd thing to see, especially when folks would come in and have this like white savior mentality, but they're from these like urban cities like New York, Los Angeles, the Bay, but actively participated in like not talking to people of color in their own communities back home. And so like I was like, what? Like it was a very like, it didn't make sense to me that they, and a lot of them got a massive reality check when they came onto their reservation with this like white savior mentality because of the way that they treated like our like janitorial staff, the way they treated other people in the community, they treated them the same way they did back at home. And so, and you can't do that because these are like these people's uncles or dads, their cousins, their brothers, and like this is, I think like there was like a self-reflection piece of like how are they treating like people in their own community.
Was there eventually sort of like they're becoming a little bit more enlightened or aware of their privilege and their paternalism, or did they just kind of like move out? Were they kicked out? How did that sort of merging of worlds end up? Because it's Teach for America, they usually go off to fancy places after they do their service, right?
Right. I don't know if I could speak for other people's experience, whether or not they really learned, if generally learned anything. What I can say is that like from my observations, some people did get kicked out. Some people like left within the first 3 months. Some people stayed within 2 years, and some people stayed longer than I did. I was there for 6 years, and someone's still there. And some went into hedge funds afterwards. Some went into state as educators. And one of them like went to go work for the governor of North Dakota and like was against the was for the pipeline and like tried to talk to me about like telling people to. And so like we met like in a very odd like, what are you doing? Like what is happening right now? And so like yeah, so it ran the gamut.
And then what would you say is the what would you say? How would you characterize the results of this Lakota culture-based education, or at least the Lakota cultural-based elements of this education on the kids? Like how how much of that element of their education is actually is, I guess, sticking with the kids?
I say it's highly effective. I don't know if my school in particular is the model in which Dakota education truly comes to life, because we still have like state guidelines for a public school. There was another high school on the reservation that was a Bureau Ed education school. What is happening is a former colleague of mine is opening up a charter school that is called a community school, which is a Lakota-based school. And we are fully Lakota. Like, it is every single step of the way, like from math to science to everything is like Lakota culture. I don't know a lot about like what the curriculum or everything is looking like, but I know they're in the phases of implementation, and I'm excited to see like what they're doing, because like what it shows from what I know is that our students were successful the most when teachers like really understood their culture and like looked like them. And so like there was a lot of that was like an important part of it.
I have a question. I've always wanted to have this sort of discussion on the concept of restorative justice. In Oakland, I don't know, it's actually not so much popular in LA where I taught, but in Oakland there's a mass ideology, sort of best practice about restorative practice. And all the trainings I've been to, all the professional development, whether it's a white person or a black person or a brown person, there's never any Indigenous person talking about it, but they always frame it as restorative justice is an Indigenous practice. And we have taken this Indigenous practice of being in circle to address harm. And there's a protocol and so on and so forth. I'm curious to know if you had an experience with this concept and your opinions on this restorative justice program in urban settings, using this sort of pan-Indian concept of what this is to heal our problems. I'm just curious about this.
This is also really great. It's like verging on the line of appropriation, but also like, yeah, I'm very familiar with restorative justice.
Okay.
I've like, it must just because like I'm very vocal about my background, but like people never say like this is Indigenous process. It's so like I don't think they would ever say it to my face. Like,
Right.
But I have heard that. Like I can't say like the values around it in particular, like where it stems from for like which particular tribe or what like reason, rhyme, or rhythm, but I know like the essence of it is that like there is this belief of like community and like restoring that community, and that is like from my experience like very central to the work that I did and a lot of folks did back on the reservation and other like native schools. To say fully like the protocol that we follow is necessarily like native owned, like I don't think so. Like I think that's like a very a way to brand it that I don't think has much merit in it. But yeah, that's my thought on it. Yeah,
appreciate that.
And then you mentioned earlier that you're currently mentoring students in college, particularly some students in Stanford. So what is I forget the term for this. What's the general college experience like for students who come from Rosebud, and then maybe more generally for Native students?
Unfortunately, like the graduation rate for students at Rosebud is very, I mean, for students who go to higher education is very low. I remember one time, I think it was like my third year as an educator, I went to this conference, and a former Teach for America teacher who taught on Rosebud made a statement saying that like we could get our kids to like the best schools in the country, but we can't get them to graduate. And I remember looking at him and being like, I'll prove you wrong. Like this is not the tale and this is not the narrative that you're going to push at a conference right now. And I remember thinking to myself, like when I started, like I think I told you like this story of like talking about decolonization and decolonizing education. I think the idea of a mentor is actually a very powerful one. Like, I think it's especially someone that has been there and seen them growing up, like understands them, checks in with them regularly, supports in a way that like a lot of my students who are here, whose families never been through a 4-year education, don't have the access to come to California. And so like I am really really there to like rethink what it means, like really rethink education. I think like a potential mentorship thing that could happen, is actually a very powerful one. And there are actual education models like actually value mentorship, especially like being a first generation like native like college student, and like in the situation I am now, like I'm more than happy to and privileged to be in the position I am to like make sure that the students that I have here like graduate.
You know, there's an interesting idea there. You're talking about going to the conference and the narrative of we get, you know, whatever that means, we get these students into these like, you know, fancy colleges, but they don't graduate. The statistics are pretty staggering in that sense. When I have communications with students who do drop out, it's kind of interesting the stories that they tell. And it's never because the work is difficult. I've never heard in the almost sort of like 20 years I've seen, these students of color are never saying, I can't do the work. It's always some other thing, usually related to money and or family, right? In some combination. You mentioned, of course, sort of these charters coming up and supporting communities in a different kind of way. Like, I wonder for both of you all, how do you imagine a different kind of institution or support post high school to support folks to be able to not just get in, but be successful in bachelor's programs? Like, what is that missing link that you've seen or heard about?
Well, my understanding was always that you have to go to the right high school, right? Because there are certain high schools that have the AP classes. Not all high schools do that. I went to a very good high school. It was a private high school, but it didn't offer AP classes. So the availability of that option is sort of patchy, I guess. But yeah, if you're a student who takes AP, I remember meeting students at UC San Diego who take AP classes, and they were on the fast track to completing their degrees because all these courses they took in high school were college credit. I think that option is available depending on where you're at, what school district you're in. So at least that's my sense. And then some people who are just in the wrong school district are unlucky and left out. But yeah, I don't know. That's always been my.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, I don't know if access to more like EP courses and like test preparation is really a great indicator of whether a student will make it through their 4 years. I think I could be wrong, but I believe research has shows that like these aptitude tests really don't show beyond the first two whether or not a student will be successful in higher education. I think like you hit the nail on the head when you said students that you've known have other factors that contribute to them not completing their 4-year degree. And from my experience, like I had plenty of students who took AP Calc who didn't complete their 4 years. And like money aside, I'm trying to understand like the idea of like what it means to be in community, not just in a student's 4 years of high school, but be in community in their lives. And right now, like I'm in that community with my students because like I'm making sure like their FAFSAs applied for, the scholarships I applied for when I was in 4 years are still available through American Indian College Fund, like Graduate Student American Indian Higher Education, like all of these are applied for, as well as like mental health. There's a unique mental health issues that Native students face. Suicide rates in the reservation Native students are a lot higher across the board. Just like making sure that I do check-ins with my students, making sure that they're okay. And like these are things that they'll seem small. Like I feel like go like go a long way. Like being like staying in the community with your students, I think like might be like a part of it.
Yeah, because I know it seems that that sense of atomization after high school, that community is lost. And for so many of the young folks out there, they're thrown into this sea of white faces, white and yellow faces mostly. And it's a strange world to navigate. So yeah, that definitely rings true.
Yeah, like especially for a group of students who like being on the reservation, being in like a very small rural community all their lives, and then like being thrown into like an institution like Stanford um,
Right.
is very shocking. Is very different. And when I say like stay in community with them, like they're gonna need to be like this is the community that they came from. This is the community that like don't lose touch. Like stay with them. Like and I don't know if that's what decolonizing education really is about, because I think like the idea of higher education is like this very independent, like I'm gonna go do my 4 years, like this is like my like way to go away from my home and like do what I do, like a very like American like individualistic idea. But like taking community approach to higher education might be a way to flip it.
Mm-hmm.
So are there like current proposals to bring more of that model to South Dakota or closer to communities?
I think like I like what tribal colleges are doing. Tribal colleges like are really like we're really set up to provide higher education um, to the community, and so like they're located in areas where you wouldn't think a rural setting would have like a place where you could get your bachelor's and your master's degree. Like a lot of reservations have access to a tribal college. Schools like Haskell Indian Nations University provide free education for Native students, and students come in cohorts from their reservations and like pretty much stay the course. The bad news is that like there isn't a lot of folks taking these opportunities up for one reason or another, and so yeah, there's a lot that um, needs to go into it.
When you were working on at the school in the res, did you have any insight into what the family lives were like of the students? Were there any sort of pervasive patterns of what that domestic situation was like, and how, if at all, it impacted the academics?
I think like what it's similar and different to like what you would see with other people of color households, like generational families living in a household. One major difference is that like these households are often these are government households. Some of them, like a lot of them are, and so like the upkeep. Like these aren't, some of them aren't the best living conditions. The impact on education is high because like needing a place to study is important. Needing a place to, like just needing a place is important.
Right.
And so like the high school, like in like middle school and elementary school does provide a place for students to like have their own place in some ways to like really study and focus.
For the high school you were at, are there actually other options for students to other, I guess, high school options, multiple high school options such as private versus public? What are the kinds of institutions that exist on the reservations that students have as options for secondary education, and where does that funding come from?
Yeah, good question. So on Rosebud, there are two high schools. There is Todd County High School, which is a state-funded high school. And then there's St. Francis Inland School, which is a Bureau of Indian Education school, which is funded by the federal government. And so both schools have different funding sources. One gets state funding in addition to like Title I funding from the government. The St. Francis Indian School is strictly federal funding through the BEI, Bureau of Indian Education, and so which is a part of the Department of Interior. So their funding is different depending on which school you go to. St. Francis didn't have to follow certain state guidelines, whereas Todd County did. But And so there's like trade-offs in both.
In the high schools, what kind of mental health services were available when you were there?
So there we had counselors available, and when I started as administrator, we started a social work program where we fully got 2 social workers, and I loved it. I like she was a really great friend of mine who she got her master's in social work, and I knew she was going to be amazing at the role, and she did a lot for our students. And so I'm praying after I left that the program is still there, because like it's such an amazing service. In addition, like there are like contracted out services with like in like our IHS that also provide mental health services too for our students. Like if there aren't enough resources at our school.
How would you compare education on Rosebud to the options available at other Lakota reservations, such as Pine Ridge, Standing Rock, compared to Standing Rock? I don't remember if Standing Rock is a Lakota reservation, but yeah, definitely like compared to Pine Ridge.
Pine Ridge, in addition to Pine Ridge, doesn't have a state school, and so it has Winaloon High School, which is a bureau school, a tribal school. But one thing that Pine Ridge does have, it has Red Cloud. Red Cloud is a high school, which is a private high school. A good friend of mine was administrator, I'm not going to name his name, talked about like Red Cloud, because it's a private high school, has a lot more autonomy to serve their students. And Red Cloud also has a wider history of getting their students to a 4-year and completing these 4-year degrees. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that like through philanthropy are able to get the best teachers on their reservation. And because of an endowment, like they're able to make sure that they ensure their students like really receive support. And I think like they do a really great job in making sure that like donors like understand their story, understand what they're doing, and like are able to like really buy into their program. And so like I really commend Red Cloud on Pine Ridge for doing what they do. Unfortunately, like we don't admit every student. Like there is an application process. There's also a test that we provide that students have to take in order for them to admit, because of space that we don't really have a lot.
That's interesting, because I still remember the sort of social attitudes that people on Rosebud have against people on Pine Ridge and stuff like that. Then I guess you have the better school on Pine Ridge, or a more exclusive one. That's kind of ironic.
What was I remember you came and visited South Dakota, like briefly when I was there. What was your perception when you just meandered through Dakota? I still remember seeing it. I was like, this is the weirdest thing. Like I had this separation of like my time in California and South Dakota, and then like in Pops and Carlos. Like, here's my friend.
Yeah.
So like, yeah, what was your like? I know it was brief. Like, what was your perception? Like, what did you see, and what did you take away?
I mean, I totally noticed the difference between the two reservations. Yeah. I mean, the starkest difference was, I mean, if only from like your own observations that you gave me, plus like things I saw there, like Rosebud actually has an Indian bar. Like it's not a dry reservation versus Pine Ridge, whereas, you know, even though people still like drink a lot on Pine Ridge. So there's Pine Ridge definitely felt more intense. Like there's a lot more intense history due to the Wounded Knee Memorial, the history of AIM. I don't know how much AIM was active in Rosebud or the other ones, but I do know like a lot of stuff happened on Pine Ridge, and you could still feel the reverberations of those conflicts. I think that was something that was pretty apparent to me. Where and then going on to Rosebud, I mean, maybe it was also because like you hosted me. Well, I was hosted by and both. I guess I was hosted on both locations. So, but yeah, like Rosebud seemed more chill. There was something about it that was more chill, less intense. Yeah, like I remember my sister because I have my half sister. My half sister, she lives on Pine Ridge, and she definitely made the way she described the reservation and the living conditions there. It even through her descriptions, it just made the area seem more intense. Like there were places you could go, there were places you couldn't. Much like in certain urban settings, and I think that was like one of the big surprises for me. Actually, you had this on Pine Ridge. You had this place which is actually the very center of the continent, one of the farthest locations you could away from any like coastline. I forget there's a term for this, which like a term for figuring out the exact center of a continent, such that it's like as far away as you can get. Hey Takashi.
Hey, sorry, I'm so late.
Yeah.
I have not
Nice to
seen this guy.
I know. Nice to see you, Aries.
Hi.
So like you could like this place is, and I think it's Kyle too. My sister lives in Kyle, which is like the town closest to this point, which is as far away as you can get from any coastline as you can on North America. And you could get so far from urban settings, right? In this very rural setting, more rural than other places I've been to, more rural than my setting, for sure. And it still had elements of an urban environment. You still had, there were barriers to certain regions that you couldn't enter because, like, there's this area that was basically like Section 8 housing or something like that, right? That was like a place she told me, yeah, you shouldn't go there, right? Because there's lots of trouble that happens there. Yeah, so there was a sense of like the need for vigilance, the need to be kind of like aware of your surroundings, to kind of distrust people because like don't don't allow people to pick up a ride, or don't allow people to pick you up for a ride, depending, make sure you kind of stick with people, so there was a lot of that. And that was very surprising for me because that was, my, like in my area, that's things are sort of peaceful. And I didn't get that sense from Rosebud. So Rosebud did feel very different. But that could also be a product of the way you presented it, right? It felt more, there was something about it that felt more welcoming and secure. Yeah.
Yeah. Pine Ridge. I like, even though I'm not a local, like hearing these like stark differences is like, yeah, that's right, Rosebud.
Yeah.
Like your observation is very accurate. Like when you talk about like the epicenter of the continent.
Yeah.
I remember like my first year, learning about that because some TFA was like, we're gonna go to the epicenter. I was like, what? And like went there and like planted a flag. I was like, this is like way too colonial for me to handle. You guys are just like, stop doing this everywhere you go. Stop putting a flag everywhere. Yeah. Takashi, how are you?
I'm doing well. I apologize for being late. We were visiting my nephew, and it was the first time my parents were able to hold him. So I just couldn't leave right away. So I apologize about that. But I'm good. Yeah, I don't know what y'all have been talking about. It sounds like it's been a great conversation. But just to catch up with Aries, I've been teaching for the past 8 years in LA. I've taught math, science, special education, and I recently got a counseling degree, or last year, and I'm going to be transitioning into that field too.
Nice. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Gosh.
Yeah, I actually.
Oh, no, sorry.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I just want to say I have to leave, unfortunately. I just want to say thank you to Aries for being here. I've learned so much in this brief amount of time, but it was very nice to meet you. And Carlos and Takashi, I'll see you next week.
See you, Daniel.
All right. Have a good one.
Yeah. How are you been, Aries?
I've been good. Life is a whirlwind.
I know.
lucky to be alive through everything. But it's so great to see you and Carlos, even virtually.
Yeah.
I feel like, yeah, this has been like a weird decade since I've seen you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there a lot of collaboration within like other tribes across the nation? I guess in terms of maybe educator and also the community.
I not so much at the school level.
Mhm.
At least not at my school. I know in tribal colleges, like we have AHEC, which is like I think stands for American Indian Higher Education Consortium. And so the tribal colleges that are located like either on or off reservations like get together and do a conference around like best practices, and we deal with like a myriad of issues facing the Americans in higher education, particularly at their tribal college. And so they do a lot that event like service local like that will service Native students.
I'm trying to think, but I feel like all those questions have been asked. It's just really good to see you and hear from you, Aries.
It is so good to see both of you. I want to do a road trip through Central and Los Angeles and on the way back to San Diego and
Yeah.
just get out of quarantine. And yeah, it's so good to hear from you both and like like hearing you guys doing amazing work. Thank you so much for like inviting me onto this podcast that you both are doing. And it's really great to hear like that you both are doing such amazing work. Hard to believe that UC San Diego was like the hotbed of like great people, but it was, especially all the crazy stuff I'm hearing happening there right now.
Yeah. I guess. Go ahead, Carlos.
I had a follow-up question to something else I asked earlier, but if you want to keep going, Takashi with.
I mean, this is a general question for both of you.
Okay.
Because I know we both went to the same university, and we were kind of in similar spaces, right? Cross Cultural Center, SAC. I know both of you were part of NASA. I know there's like different organizations that were there. Like, just being there and like looking back on it, like over a decade later, how do you? I guess like just what's kind of like your reflection or understanding like where you are to this day. I don't know. I guess I'm trying to ask is like, how has the experience of the stuff we did at UCSD kind of impact to where we are to this day?
I would love to hear your thoughts on this too, Takashi.
Yeah, I'll definitely share too.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about UCSD as of late, just mainly because I have nothing else I could do. Because it's just been, but I think like it was very pivotal as far as like my own like personal development, and like I think UC San Diego was like the place where like I really understood and like grappled with like what empathy really meant, and like what lines of differences really meant, and what it means to authentically communicate. And like I still cherish like all the connections and friendships I made during my time there. Yeah, that's how I'm like taking away from it.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. For me, it was definitely where. For me, it was more about, I guess, developing professional skills, because the highlight for me at UCSD was definitely my work with my research mentor, my research advisor, and he sort of was responsible for exposing me to this whole world, the whole world of academia and the procedures and types of activities that they engage in, such as conferences and publications. Like that was something that was extremely foreign to me before UCSD, and even before working with him while still at UCSD. So that's definitely something I took away from that kind of basically exposure to the world of research and like the kind of work that people do in that. Besides that, it was definitely like UCSD was also, for me, it was, for me, beyond that, it was a lot of learning to navigate institutions, I guess, to navigate institutions, to navigate relationships with people within that institution. I get like Aries said, like learning to communicate effectively.
Yeah.
And then ultimately kind of getting used to a new environment. Yeah, because I remember having like some culture shock in college. Yeah, for sure. So learning how to get used to that.
Yeah, kind of similar to what both of you said. I felt the same way too. I had a culture shock, even though I'm only 2 hours away from San Diego. I think it was the first time where I saw a lot of class differences and race differences, right? It was the first time where I've been in an environment where there's a lot of whites and Asians. And I also realized that, oh, okay, even the Asians at the campus, like I felt like I couldn't connect with some of them. And part of it was like the class differences, right? Like some of them came from different neighborhoods. Maybe they came from like maybe more white neighborhoods or more privileged areas. I think the idea of privilege became more aware when I was at the university. And also I started to explore my own self-identity because, you know, I've always never really thought about my cultural identity because even though I have a Japanese name, my family's from Laos in Southeast Asia. And that was something that I began to explore and do more research on, like the history of like the Vietnam War and how it affected them going to, you know, Japan as refugees here. Like if I hadn't gone to UCSD, or like universities that's was like further away from my home, I don't know if I would have really explored that, right? Because if I'm in a situation where I'm kind of used to or comfortable, then I'll just kind of go along with the flow. And getting involved with you know, the cross cultural center and different orgs that, you know, we all know about, especially like the immigrant rights org that was part of, kind of made me also have a very critical lens of like news, of different like work done by professors. So it just kind of gave me a different perspective on what I used to believe growing up, you know, like history, being ethnic studies major. And I was also a math major too. I don't know. It's just the different variety of the interaction with the people, like y'all said about communication skills. It just kind of, yeah, and I hate to admit it, it kind of developed me into who I am today because I don't like to give UCSD a lot of credit, you know. But yeah, it did shape who I am today. And like I was thinking, like if I had gone to a different university, would I be the person who I am today? You know. So that's it. Definitely has shaped me in different directions.
Yeah, I talking to other alum, I I posed the question like, would we be the same people if we had gone anywhere else? Like, would we? And you know, I think it's one of those things that I don't know if we'll ever have the answer, but I'm just grateful to have the opportunity to like talk with amazing folks like yourself. Well,
Yeah,
definitely.
I'm glad I met you, Aries and Takashi. I'm very grateful for that. I really wanted to ask my follow-up question. I like this. I like the direction of this conversation, but I feel like this might be a good question for this session, and because we were talking earlier about the differences between Rosebud and Pine Ridge, but beyond that, another thing I recall from my experience visiting was the sense of the idea of borders, and that was another thing that I noticed, like paralleled our greater experience of, like, you know, people with the greater experience that people have within, like, the experience of like the broader community in this country, right? Especially going back to like living in San Diego and having like the Mexican border right there, and having like this very strong sense of like national borders imprinted onto us, right? Like, so when I visited the reservations, there was that same concept again. You had this concept of like borders between reservation and non-reservation land, and then also the idea of border towns, right? And the significance of border towns, like what makes them distinct, right? There's very special qualities that border towns have that allow them to earn that designation, right? There's some special politics they have, right? Like okay, like Whitehorse, or I forget the name of like that very famous border town that's in Nebraska that makes like millions of dollars like selling alcohol. What's the name? Yeah, Whitecliff. Yeah, that, which is a border town, but then also like a couple others. Like I remember my sister telling me about border towns, like generally, right? And so I wonder how that dynamic kind of plays out with high school kids, right? Like how do they sort of navigate these spaces within? How do they navigate going into like high school And then outside, like, how do they navigate those spaces outside of high school, right? And how does maybe their education impact their experience of those spaces?
You're asking like such a profound question.
Yeah.
No, and it's also really good. I can't divorce this conversation from what's currently happening right now with COVID-19. I could tell you, like currently, like Rosebud and another reservation in South Dakota have like locked down. We have enforced like the idea of sovereignty, the idea of like, you know, the Western idea of like nationhood, and have prevented like unlimited access for people coming in and out of the reservation, and have really enforced certain mandates within the boundaries of the reservation to prevent the spread of COVID-19. And the border towns that you talked about, such as like for the ones in Rosebud, are like Winter, Valentine, Nebraska. All of these folks are like highly conservative, have notions of what reservation life is like, and even though like only a few miles away, like have these very negative connotations of what Native American children and Native American people are like. And so they view these blockades or like these checkpoints as like how dare these like dirty Native people like put up these like borders. And it became like a contention with the state government of South Dakota. Like the governor itself like sent a letter to Donald Trump being like, hey, like we need help, like the natives are at it again, like we put up these checkpoints, and we want access, which is weird because like these weird town people never wanted to go to the reservation in the first place, they're afraid. But like Rosebud itself like has a major like US highway going through it, and so it like even though these checkpoints don't prevent people from coming through, I guess in some ways it slows down. And I think like the point of it is like to prevent the spread of COVID-19. And your question about like how do these border towns impact like youth and like growing up and like interactions with it? The border towns are the place where a lot of racism occurs. When I went to pump gas at the border town to the reservation, like I was called a prairie N-word. And a lot of students and a lot of like family members like will be called like derogatory terms just to get gas. And unfortunately, like these border towns are the places where the movie theaters are located, where a close shopping center is located, where a close, and like you said, like White Place in particular, like it was a particularly important border town that you named because like that's where liquor was sold. And because Pine Ridge is a dry reservation, like alcohol is illegal to buy, folks have to go to this very racist and very like exploitive border town to buy alcohol. And so there's these particular like relationships that you said that the reservations in these border towns have, which is interesting because like a lot of these border towns also have contracts with institutions, like particularly schools and hospitals on the reservation, such as like contracting with like a construction and like other things. And so these border towns actually make a lot of money off of the reservation. I think a lot of their money actually comes from like reservation contracts, but their attitude towards the Americans are so racist and so bad that like Native folks have to like, let's just make our own business. Like, let's stop doing business with these border towns and like, you know, start our own thing so we don't have to deal with these racist like policies and everything that we do. And so like, but like I said earlier, do like federal regulations, federal things, like businesses can't really start up on the reservation, so it's a lot harder.
Yeah, when you were describing that also sounds like other borders too, like
Right.
in other countries in this country, like the U.S.-Mexico border, you know, like Palestine, Israel, just like different parts of the world too. Just it's like very similar. Like I was also curious too, is there like international solidarity with other Indigenous people across the world? Just like I'm sure like each tribe or each group is a little different, but
yeah, that's a really good question. Thinking locally, like and expanding globally, like I think it's hard enough to like something about being on Rosebud is very isolating. However, what we saw in 2016 was like when the pipeline was coming through, we gained global attention. To the point where the tribal president of Saniyok went to the United Nations and like spoke. It got so big, like nothing since like American Indian movement in the 1960s, that wasn't such a movement. Unfortunately, like politics got involved and like the tribal president was voted out, and I'm not like the fallout from it has its own ripple effects, but the potential is there to do solidarity like globally with other Indigenous communities. But I think like a lot of local issues keep us very local, and so like there isn't enough to do. Yeah, not to say that like we aren't aware of everything that's happening outside of our reservations. Like currently right now, like there's a lot going on with the Black Lives Matter movement. Tribal members and like people on reservations like are like in massive solidarity and allyship with what's going on. I think when things were happening with the oil pipeline, like Flint was also doing like a water crisis. Like there is massive solidarity across like Black and Native like communities. Because I think like a lot of those things that we experience are very similar, but like our realities are different.
Oh, that's awesome. That's often something I feel like we don't often hear about, the Black and Native solidarity.
Yeah, I think it's because of how we experience racism is different. I think like genocide was the operating mechanism around like in like Native American policies, and so its like main function is like to have us disappear. And so like when it comes to like looking at statistics, looking at other like demographics, like Native Americans aren't really shown, despite like these drastic, massive statistics that show Native American suicide rates being high. Native American incarceration rates are like exceptionally high. Other things that like we should be included in national conversations are not. It's because of the system genocide that has focused on our erasure, so that way the U.S. like colonial system could exist on our land. Racism in conjunction to like the Black community is much more aligned with capitalism, much more aligned to like commodities, and so like I think that's why like the conversation around like is different.
Yeah. Oh, I don't know if this was addressed, but what type of supports are there in the reservation, particularly in Rosebud, like for mental health, like in terms of like healing, spiritual healing, like like social emotional well-being? Like, yeah, I'm just curious to hear about that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I talked briefly about like what's available as far as like what systems are available as far as like IHS, Indian Health Services, provides like some form of mental health. The schools provide like counselors, but within the reservation itself, like there are like people host sweats. One of my students' father started the Boys with Braids program, which is essentially like a Lakota men like nonprofit that's focus is on like building Native men and like really getting Native men to like feel pride and like address issues such as mental health. And there are like traditional ways that mental health is being addressed. That's also there. Unfortunately, it's not, there isn't enough, but it's there, yeah.
And are most of the mental health folks from the community, or are they like outsiders from the reservation?
I think it's a mixed bag.
Yeah.
Like I've said, I think folks who work within IHS and like other social programs are from outside the community. Sometimes they'll try to get folks within the community to work in conjunction, if not within the programs. Everything done in the traditional way is all done within the community. But unfortunately, like elders are, they're dying. A lot of traditional ways are slowly changing. Yeah.
Do you have any recommendation on books?
On books?
Yeah, but I always like to ask these questions. Like, do you have like a book recommendation?
Yeah, actually, King Yang, do you remember him?
Which one?
King Yang.
Oh, yeah.
He wrote a book with Eve Tuck called Land Pedagogy.
Oh.
Hold on, let me look this up. He actually uses a shadow name called Love Paperson. It's so weird. No, trust me, it's so weird. I love him though, but he wrote this book called Land Pedagogy. Let me try to find it. I'm gonna I wrote Land Petals. Land Pedagogy.
I remember he wrote an article about like settler colonialism with Eve Tuck. I don't know if this is the same one.
No, this is a full-on book, and I think what's within this book is actually very. I think it's actually very profound. Here, I'll just send it on this chat here.
Land education, postcolonial, decolonizing perspective. Wow. Oh wow. Huh, there's only one left in stock.
Oh what? Oh, get the Kindle.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's true.
Get the Kindle.
It's a rare book. What was something you liked about this book?
I think like what I liked about it was that they talked about decolonization as healing, and often when I hear about decolonization, at least when I was an undergrad, it's it has like a somewhat violent connotation of like we need to reclaim our land, we need to like upheave capitalism, we need to like dismantle the United States, which is very taxing. I have a hard time like doing a lot like mundane things, and I think like rethinking and like potentially positioning decolonization as a form of healing is also profound in its own way, because like we have a lot to heal from. There's a lot of PTSD in addition to the resiliency that we have, and like we need a space in order to really communicate and flesh that out. And I think like we're like a good place for us to heal, like could potentially in our schools.
That's cool. I'll check it out. I mean, I feel like this could be like a multiple episode too.
Yeah.
It's a big topic. And Aries, I don't know if Carlos has mentioned it last week, or not last week. I think about 2 weeks ago, we had Leslie on the show. She was talking about the early intervention in the deaf and hard of hearing community.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. It's phenomenal to see like where a lot of us landed after being nearly burnt out of UCSD. And I don't know. I think we had like a very collectively like unique experience at the university, which is also like extremely reflective of what's happening nationally right now. Like I think we really try to change the system. And I think like we're approaching the point where, or we are in the point where we are like effectively changing the system.
I feel like most of us are working in the field of education or nonprofit or something related to that sort.
I know some of us are working in policy, and some are journalists, some are doing some really phenomenal work. And I wish if we could do like a virtual reunion. Maybe we could do a virtual reunion actually.
Yeah, actually that would be really cool.
Possibility. That's not a wild idea.
What would you tell people? I guess like outsiders or people who barely know about the reservations or the Native American community. I guess what's something you would want them to know like before going into like a reservation, or maybe for folks who want to teach there through TFA or different programs?
It's a really great question. Also, like, I think like something that I would advise like a new teacher going into these spaces is like one, like be willing to learn. Like there's a lot of humility in teaching, and two, like, you know, these families and these communities are trusting you with their students' education. And so that's a responsibility that shouldn't be taken lightly. I need to get going, but it's been so great meeting with you guys. I hope the things I said made sense, Carlos. I think I rambled like a lot during this time.
No, it's perfect. That's fine.
Cool. All right. I hope you guys are safe, and thank you for letting me join you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for joining us. I'll listen to it later because I'm the one that edits and produces it. But I apologize for coming in late, but it was just a pleasure having you here, Aries, and just sharing your experiences. And I know it's a topic that most people don't know about, and I'm glad that, you know, you were able to share the experiences and other folks can listen to it and learn about it.
Yeah, so glad. Yeah, hopefully, hopefully, like what I said was enlightening in some way. But all right, cool. I sent you the book. Let me send you the article I listened in Business Insider with everything in Apple. And with that, I think I will put it very well. All right, bye guys.
Thank you,
All
Aries.
right, thanks. Thanks.